This Reformation Day, as we're looking at a couple different reformers, I want to take us off of the European continent and to the land of Scotland, looking at the great reformer John Knox. Now, the landscape of Scotland at his birth and in the early years of his life were really formed around two split kingdoms, England in the south and the Kingdom of Scotland in the north. Neither kingdom really cared for the other. There was great animosity between the two. But Scotland was a much poorer and less developed kingdom at this point in time than England was. And so along this was the competing alliances of each kingdom that they made with countries on the European continent. England made ties with Spain, and Scotland made ties with the Kingdom of France. In fact, as a way of strengthening that alliance with France, James V, King of Scots, married a French woman, Mary of Guise. And they had a daughter named Mary herself, who would eventually become known as Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots was a very devout Roman Catholic, but she was also the great-granddaughter of the Catholic Henry VII of England, giving her a right to the English throne. Now, moving to the Kingdom of England, however, Henry VIII had three children of his own who would eventually ascend the throne after him. King Henry VIII, his first heir, his rightful heir, was King Edward VI, but then following him was Mary of Tudor, who would later become known as Bloody Mary, and then Queen Elizabeth. Now, King Edward VI was a Protestant and sympathetic to the Reformation in both Scotland and England, but he was very sickly even from the time he was a little child, and so he really couldn't stay upon the throne for very long and died shortly after ascending the throne. But after his death, Bloody Mary took after the throne, and she was the first in line after Edward because she was the older half-sister to Elizabeth. And so she was the daughter of Henry's first wife and therefore a very staunch Catholic. So she persecuted and executed so many Protestants in England during her very short reign of the throne. And after her death in 1558, Queen Elizabeth took the throne, and she went and pursued Reformation in England since she and herself and her mother were Protestant. However, instead of wanting to go extreme with Protestantism, she saw a middle ground in the Church of England, seeking unity amidst some theological differences. The only groups she really sought to keep from having fellowship with were really the Roman Catholic Church and the extreme reformers. Now, moving back to our main reformer, John Knox himself. Well, he was born in 1514, just 3 years before Martin Luther would post his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. And Knox was educated and later ordained as a priest in the Catholic Church in 1536. But he was actually converted to Christ and the Protestant faith, the Reformed faith, in about 1543. And as a new believer, he followed this Protestant preacher, George Wishart, and he worked even as Wishart's bodyguard for some time. But unfortunately, Wishart ended up getting martyred, and in retaliation, the Catholic Cardinal Beaton was eventually murdered by Protestants. While taking refuge from the Roman Catholics in St. Andrew's Castle with the other Protestants, Knox would be appointed their preacher in 1547 and preach his first sermon on Daniel chapter 7. But unfortunately, the Catholic France sent aid to Mary of Guise, who was acting as regent for her underage daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, at the time, and the castle fell, and Knox was taken as a galley slave on the French ship for about 19 months. Knox, when at this time, was actually given a painting of the Virgin Mary by these Frenchmen on the ship and was told to kiss this picture of the Virgin Mary. But Knox, in his very bold and brave nature, actually said these words. He said, "Let Our Lady save herself. She is light enough. Let her learn to swim." And then he just tossed the painting of the Virgin Mary out of the ship into the water. So during this time as a galley slave, Henry VIII in England died, and soon his son, Edward VI, ascended to the throne, and it was by Edward's help that Knox was actually released from his slavery and then called Knox towards England to be a pastor in a few different places, but then served as one of Edward's great counselors during his reign. However, as I mentioned earlier, he was sickly and died shortly thereafter. And with the Roman Catholic Mary Tudor taking the throne, Knox had to flee into exile towards the European continent. Now, Knox spent some time pastoring an English exile church in Frankfurt, Germany, before being forced out of that church due to theological differences. And it was at this time that Knox went to Geneva, where John Calvin was pastoring and teaching, and Knox pastored an English church again there in Geneva. However, while he was there, he secretly returned to Scotland, married his first wife, and then returned to Geneva not long after with her when he was found out in Scotland. So Knox learned much from Calvin during his time in Geneva. But Bloody Mary, after her death and Elizabeth's ascent to the throne, there were rumors of revolution stirring in Scotland. And Knox soon received pleas from the Reformed in Scotland to come back and lead the Reformation, lead the revolution. So finally, in about 1559, the time had finally come for Knox to be able to go back to his homeland, to his beloved Scotland. It was then, in 1560, that he had actually helped pen the Scots Confession with 5 other men, all of whom happened to be named John. This was the great Scottish confession of faith that would lead the Scottish Presbyterian Church, that would be the mainstay of the Scottish Protestant faith in the land. However, unfortunately, in 1560, it was also that year when his first wife, Marjorie, died, leaving him to father their 2 sons alone. Now, it wasn't long after Mary, Queen of Scots, came back to Scotland from France as queen when she was finally of age. But at this point, Mass had already been outlawed in Scotland, and as a favor to the Queen, the Scottish Parliament actually allowed Mary, Queen of Scots, the devout Catholic, to have private Mass for herself in her own chapel. Knox was not very happy with this, and he knew that as she traveled about the country, she kept setting up new chapels where she could have Mass had every time she was there, and leaving priests at those chapels to continue giving Mass to the people. Knox clearly saw this as idolatry and often spoke against the Queen's idolatry, leading to several conversations and confrontations with the Queen herself. And during her reign, Knox continued to prove that he was a very bold man who feared no human being by consistently preaching the pure gospel and against idolatry, which he especially saw in the Roman Catholic Church with their Mass. But in 1564, the same year he married his second wife, Margaret, Knox penned the history of the Reformation of religion in Scotland. But it was in 1572 when Knox, who had grown old and frail, learned of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, when the French Roman Catholics killed somewhere around 50,000 Protestants in about a week. Knox, hearing the news with great horror, climbed up into the pulpit of the High Kirk in Edinburgh and preached one last sermon against the cruel murderer, the King of France. But it wasn't very long after that, just some days after that sermon, on November 24th, 1572 in Edinburgh, when alongside his second wife, Margaret, by his side, Knox would breathe his last. And it was in that moment where the great Scottish reformer, one of the boldest preachers, a lion in the pulpit, passed away. But it wasn't before the great Reformation of Scotland had already taken heart, already taken root, and it gave birth to what would become known as the Scottish Presbyterian Covenanters, who would even go on to be among the great Puritans who would write the Westminster Confession of Faith. So some of the great confessions of our Christian faith even find their roots in the Scottish Reformation, head by the great reformer, John Knox, who even has his statue alongside Calvin even today.